So in the next couple of slides, we're going to have a look at 8 different aquatic biomes. Number 1, lakes, the physical environment. Standing bodies of water range from ponds a few square meters in area to lakes covering thousands of square kilometers. Light decreases with depth, creating stratification. Temperate lakes may have seasonal thermocline. Tropical lowland lakes have a thermocline year-round. Chemical environment. Oligotrophic lakes tend to be nutrient poor and generally oxygen rich. Eutrophic lakes are nutrient rich and often depleted of oxygen in the deepest zone in summer and if covered with ice in winter. Geologic features. Oligotrophic lakes tend to have less surface area relative to their depth than eutrophic lakes. Photosynthetic organisms. Rooted and aquatic plants in lakes live in the littoral zone, the shallow, well-lit waters close to shore. Further from shore, where water is too deep to support rooted aquatic plants, the limnetic zone is inhabited by a variety of phytoplankton, including cyanobacteria. Heterotrophs. In the limnetic zone, small drifting heterotrophs or zooplankton graze on the phytoplankton. The benthic zone is inhabited by assorted invertebrates whose species composition depends partially on oxygen levels. Fishes live in all zones with sufficient oxygen. Human impact. Runoff from fertilized land and dumping of waste leads to nutrient enrichment, which can produce large numbers of algae, resulting in oxygen depletion. Number 2. Wetlands. Physical environment. A wetland is a habitat that is inundated by water at least some of the time and that supports plants adapted to water-saturated soil. Some wetlands are inundated at all times, whereas others flood infrequently. Chemical environment. Because of high organic production by plants and decomposition by microbes and other organisms, both the water and the soils are periodically low in dissolved oxygen. Wetlands have a high capacity to filter dissolved nutrients and chemical pollutants. Geologic features. Basin wetlands develop in shallow basins, ranging from upland depressions to filled-in lakes and ponds. Riverine wetlands develop along shallow and periodically flooded banks of rivers and streams. Fringe wetlands occur along the coasts of large lakes and seas where water flows back and forth because of rising lake levels or tidal action. Thus, fringe wetlands include both freshwater and marine biomes. Photosynthetic organisms. Wetlands are among the most productive biomes on Earth. The water-saturated soils favour the growth of plants such as pond lilies and cattails, sedges, bald cypress and black spruce, which have adaptations enabling them to grow in water or in soil that is periodically anaerobic owing to the presence of unaerated water. Heterotrophs. Wetlands are home to a diverse community of invertebrates, birds and many other organisms. Human impact. Wetlands help purify water and reduce peak flooding. Draining and filling have destroyed up to 90% of wetlands in Europe. Number 3. Streams and rivers. Physical environment. The most prominent physical characteristic of streams and rivers is the speed and volume of their flow. Headwater streams are generally cold, clear, swift and turbulent. Further downstream, where numerous tributaries may have joined, forming a river, the water is generally warmer and more turbid because of suspended sediment. Streams and rivers are stratified into vertical zones. Chemical environment. The salt and nutrient content of streams and rivers increases from the headwaters to the mouth. Headwaters are generally rich in oxygen. Downstream water may also contain substantial oxygen, except where there has been organic enrichment. Geologic features. Headwater stream channels are often narrow, have a rocky bottom, and alternate between shallow sections and deeper pools. The downstream stretches of rivers are generally wide and meandering. River bottoms are often silty from sediments deposited over long periods of time. Photosynthetic organisms. Headwater streams that flow through grasslands or deserts may be rich in phytoplankton or rooted aquatic plants. Heterotrophs. A great diversity of fishes and invertebrates inhabit unpolluted rivers and streams, distributed according to and throughout the vertical zones. Human impact. Municipal, agricultural and industrial pollution degrade water quality and kill aquatic organisms. Damming and flood control impair the natural functioning of stream and river ecosystems and threaten migratory species such as salmon. So how can salmon get past a dam and continue on their journey? Well, there are many solutions. Let's look at one now.
There's something unusual going on at the Cle Elum Dam in Washington State. See that long tube along the river going over the dam and into the lake? That's a fish transport system by Whoosh Innovations that gives migrating salmon a free joyride over an impassable dam. Its nickname? The Salmon Cannon.
From the fish's perspective, this is a instantaneous transport over a large barrier that they never could have gone over before.
That's right. This portable system costing around $10 million, about 1/6 the cost of traditional fish passages, uses a tube filled with air and water mist to safely transport migrating salmon more than a kilometer from the river, over the dam, and into the lake above.
So here's where it all begins. The salmon swim upstream against the current, and when they get to this pass, they will naturally swim into the system, and that's where their incredible journey begins.
Once inside, the salmon swim through a small waterfall and into a chute, which then takes them inside a scanner that makes sure they're actually a salmon.
The scanner sends the information to our sorting computer, and the sorting computer switches this gate. And the gate says, all right, it's either going to the Whoosh tube or it's a reject fish. We're not going to transport that one.
And this all happens automatically?
All automatically, yep. And in the span of less than a second.
Wow.
But the real wow factor starts when the salmon is shot into the flexible tube like a rocket. Let's see that again, in slow motion.
So now I'm at the top of the dam, which is 50 meters high. The salmon travel overhead through the tube at a speed of 45 kilometers per hour.
The entire bullet train-like journey, taking less than 60 seconds, ends with a final splash into the lake, where the unscathed salmon swims off to spawn.
The Yakima system historically had about 800,000 salmon returning here every year. That was the second largest run attached to the Columbia itself. And by the early 90s, because all of these dams were built without salmon and fish passage, we were down to 3,000 to 4,000.
The return of salmon in the Pacific Northwest is especially important to the Yakima Nation, a group of Native American tribes that revere salmon.
So let's have a look at number 4, estuaries. First thing is the physical environment. An estuary is a transition area between the river and the sea. Chemical environment involves the salinity, how it varies spatially within estuaries from nearly that of freshwater to that of seawater. The geologic features, things like tidal waters, and they create a complex network of tidal channels. There is islands, there are natural levees and mudflats. Photosynthetic organisms, salt marsh grasses and algae, including phytoplankton, are the major producers in estuaries. Heterotrophs. Estuaries support an abundance of worms, oysters, crabs, and many fish species that humans consume. Many marine invertebrates and fishes use estuaries as a breeding ground or migrate through them to freshwater habitats upstream. Estuaries are also crucial feeding areas for waterfowl and some marine mammals. Human impact. Filling, dredging, and pollution from upstream have disrupted estuaries worldwide. Number 5. Intertidal zones. Physical environment. An intertidal zone is periodically submerged and exposed by the tides, twice daily on most marine shores. Chemical environment. Oxygen and nutrient levels are generally high and renewed with each turn of the tides. Geologic features. The substrates of intertidal zones, which are generally either rocky or sandy, select for particular behavior and anatomy among intertidal organisms. The configuration of bays or coastlines influences the magnitude of the tides and the relative exposure of intertidal organisms to wave action. Photosynthetic organisms. High diversity and biomass of attached marine algae inhabit rocky intertidal zones, especially in the lower zone. Heterotrophs. Many of the animals in rocky intertidal environments have structural adaptations that allow them to attach to the hard substrate. Many of the animals in sandy or muddy intertidal zones, such as worms, clams, and predatory crustaceans, bury themselves and feed as the tides bring sources of food. Human impact. Oil pollution has disrupted many intertidal areas. The construction of rock walls and barriers to reduce erosion from waves and storm surges has disrupted this zone in some locations. Number 6. Oceanic pelagic zone. Physical environment. The oceanic pelagic zone is a vast realm of open blue water, constantly mixed by wind-driven oceanic currents. Chemical environment. Oxygen levels are generally high. Nutrient concentrations are generally lower than in coastal waters. Turnover between fall and spring renews nutrients in the photic zones of temperate and high latitude ocean areas. Geologic features. This biome covers approximately 70% of Earth's surface and has an average depth of nearly 4,000 meters. Photosynthetic organisms. The dominant photosynthetic organisms are phytoplankton, including photosynthetic bacteria that drift with the ocean currents. Heterotrophs. The most abundant heterotrophs in this biome are zooplankton. These protists, worms, copepeds, shrimp-like krill, jellies, and small larvae of invertebrates and fishes graze on photosynthetic plankton. Human impact. Overfishing has depleted fish stocks in all Earth's oceans. Marine life has also been harmed by pollution, ocean acidification, plastic pollution, and global warming. Number 7. Coral reefs. Physical environment. Coral reefs are formed largely from the calcium carbonate skeletons of coral. They are sensitive to temperatures below about 18 to 20 degrees C and above 30 degrees C. Deep-sea coral reefs found between 200 and 1500 meters are less known than their shallow counterparts, but harbour as much diversity as many shallow reefs do. Chemical environment. Corals require high oxygen levels and are excluded by high inputs of fresh water and nutrients. Geologic features. Corals require a solid substrate for attachment. A typical coral reef begins as a fringing reef on a young high island, forming an offshore barrier reef later in the history of the island and becoming a coral atoll as the older island submerges. Photosynthetic organisms. Unicellular algae live within the tissues of the corals, forming a mutualistic relationship that provides the corals with organic molecules. Heterotrophs. Corals. A diverse group of cnidarians are themselves the predominant animals on coral reefs. Overall animal diversity on coral reefs rivals that of tropical forests. Human impact. Global warming and pollution may be contributing to large-scale coral death. Development of coastal mangroves for aquaculture has reduced spawning grounds for many species of reef fishes. Number 8. Marine benthic zone. Physical environment. The marine benthic zone consists of the seafloor below the surface waters of the coastal neritic zone and the offshore pelagic zone. Except for shallow near-coastal areas, the marine benthic zone receives no sunlight. Water temperature declines with depth while pressure increases. As a result, organisms in the very deep benthic or abyssal zone are adapted to continuous cold, about 3 degrees C, and very high water pressure. Chemical environment. Except in areas of oxygen enrichment, oxygen is usually present at sufficient concentrations to support diverse animal life. Geologic features. Soft sediments cover most of the benthic zone. However, there are areas of rocky substrate on reefs, submarine mountains, and new oceanic crust. Autotrophs, unique assemblages of organisms, live near deep-sea hydrothermal vents on mid-ocean ridges. In these dark, hot environments, the food producers are chemoautotrophic prokaryotes that obtain energy by oxidizing H2S, formed by a reaction of the hot water with dissolved sulfate. Heterotrophs. Neritic benthic communities include numerous invertebrates and fishes. Among the animals of the deep-sea hydrothermal vent communities are giant tube worms, some more than 1 meter long. Human impact. Overfishing has decimated important benthic fish populations, such as the cod of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Dumping of organic wastes has created oxygen-deprived benthic areas.